Hello and welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. We have a very special guest today, Rick Strassman, who is really a pioneer in the current psychedelic revolution with his groundbreaking work on DMT. And we're super excited and grateful to have you on today, Rick. Thanks for coming.
Sure. When was I on last? Do y'all remember?
It's about a year ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was at least a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've upgraded my internet, I think maybe 18 months ago or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but still, it's nice to be on your show again.
Thank you. You
So
you
you brought up the Joe Rogan podcast. I just want to get that out of the way because it's like kind of fascinating, but it's not like a huge topic that we want to discuss. But yeah, how'd you? Because like you said, I mean, we know about you that you weren't really in the public spotlight much like 4 or 5 years ago, and then you started doing more podcasts and more interviews and stuff, at least as far as I know. And we're just curious, like what it was like for you, like what that whole experience is like. Was it?
Yeah, it was pretty weird. Spending uh, 4 hours in a studio, with Joe Rogan is pretty intense.
yeah.
Um, we sat down around 1:20 or so, and we, finally, called it a day around 5:20. So we took a lot of breaks, but still, I had to be on. Um, well, it was good. It was fun. I've known Joe a long time. I met him. Well, we spoke on the phone, 2005, I think. And you know, and I hadn't, you know, I hadn't heard of him. Uh, I'm at, I'm at that time. I had to even ask around, but I got an email from somebody that said, "Oh, Joe Rogan's talking about your book." And I said, "Who's Joe Rogan?" And he kind of filled me in, and he gave me Joe's phone number. I guess that's the way I got it, and I called Joe to thank him for publicizing the DMT book. And he said, "Hey man, uh, I'm at, I'm at the airport. I'm reading your book again right now. It's great. Anything I can do to let people know about it." So we met a few hours. I mean, a few years later in Los Angeles. My family was out there, and and we had coffee at the local Starbucks and hung out a bit. And there were a couple of opportunities to appear on his podcast previously, but it really didn't quite seem the right time um, it- until the coming release of the new book, the Psychedelic Handbook. There's been an explosion, obviously, in interest in psychedelics, and I think some people are going away with the wrong impression. Like psychedelics are panaceas and they have no harmful effects, and I don't. That's not true. But still, it's becoming increasingly popular belief, being uh, promoted by the media and people who aren't really experts in the field. They don't have much experience
Yeah.
with doing psychotherapy, doing research, anything. They're not scientists. Uh, so it seemed a good time to write a book, a, grounded um, little textbook on uh, psychedelics, to kind of set the record straight, as it were,
Yeah.
to give
Yeah.
a more balanced approach to the pros and cons.
Which is
Yeah,
which is
and I kind of worked out my rap with the book, uh, uh, and that was one of the reasons that I wanted to hold off on any interviews with Rogan, is that I wanted to have uh, um, my spiel pretty well worked out first. And in the process of writing the book, I want to accomplish that.
Yeah, and so you're just talking about your latest book.
Yeah, the Psychedelic Handbook.
On the Psychedelic Handbook.
Right.
I want to thank you for writing that book, because when I first got into psychedelics a few years ago, that was like the book that I needed. It would have really helped me and mitigated some of the negative things that came about kind of going in it without that knowledge. And I think, that's kind of, that should be the go-to book for anyone who is interested in psychedelics.
I mean,
well, hopefully, that is my intention. The longest, the longest of the book's chapters is called How to Trip. So it's a step-by-step process of getting ready, making certain decisions, how to manage the experience, what to do if you get into trouble, how to integrate the experience, if you're going to trip again, and when and why, and all those things. So the last of the biggest of the chapters is quite practical. But I do cover each of the drugs: LSD, MDMA, ketamine, even psilocybin, etc. And I give a historical background of the field.
I was surprised
how the drugs may work.
I was surprised that you talked about salvia. Not that it's not very psychedelic, but not a lot of people talk about it in the psychedelic field as much. I was wondering if you had any personal experience with salvia.
Yeah, I did, and I hated it. Yeah, it was just terrifying. I thought like, I'm never doing this again. Yeah. But the publisher wanted me to include salvia and MDMA and ketamine. So the smallest of the chapters is on salvia. Salvia divinorum.
Yeah.
The active ingredient is salvinorin A.
Did you?
One of my friends in LA was the first person to discover that you could smoke the pure compound, or vaporize the pure compound, as opposed to having to stick a quid of leaves in your cheek.
Yeah.
And is just starting to be used by the underground, and he sent me some, and I I way overdosed on it. I figured I could handle this. And it was a it was a true hallucinogen. I was interacting with a hallucination. This 40-foot tall guy in a bowler hat appeared in a hole in my roof and my ceiling, wearing like a brown suit, and he looked down at me and he said, "It's time to go now." And he started pulling me into his pant leg, and I was being dissolved and being transformed into the material in his pant leg. And my poor wife, at the time we were married, and she didn't know what to do. My friend Daniel Siebert, who sent us the salvinorin, told us lock the doors, hide the keys, because people go crazy and they interact with their hallucinations and they can hurt themselves.
Yeah.
So my wife locked up the house and hid the keys, which was a good thing, because I wanted to run outside and see if the rest of the world was being metamorphosed, like the bedroom was.
Yeah. So I wanted to say something about salvia. Like, to my understanding, it's the strongest natural psychedelic known to man. Now, LSD could be stronger, but they're both, but that's synthetic. But they're both weighed out in the microgram. So if you think about, if you just like use your rational mind and you think you're taking the salvia and you're extracting it into such a extracted amount, like it's 50 times or whatever, that's an extremely large dose compared to I would argue the natural way of doing it is just chewing the leaves, which you can still get a profound experience from, right? And although the experience is not quite as I guess catapulting, or they say G-force, but it is like a longer experience. So I think it would be more like comparing to like DMT, it'd be more like, if chewing it would be more like drinking the ayahuasca, whereas smoking the salvia is more like smoking the DMT. I would say, I mean, I would argue.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, have you tried the quid? Chewing
Uh,
the leaves in your cheek like that?
I have, but only like 10 leaves. It really wasn't enough to feel it.
I've heard of people
Hmm.
chewing the quid in lower doses. They find it actually really pleasurable. But everyone I know that has smoked it, the high dose, they all say it's terrifying and, wouldn't do it
It's
again.
just terrifying. Yeah. It freaked me out actually. Like it, kind of indicated to me I had no idea what I was doing with psychedelics. Yeah, it kind of like reoriented my approach to my research in some ways. Yeah, and I kept on looking at my arm, where the transition was occurring, being drawn into this guy's pant leg. Like for a week, I was looking at my arm, like, is it okay? Yeah, so
It
That's wild.
had like a lasting impression on you.
it did. Yeah, it made me realize I needed to tread more carefully, perhaps.
It's a good message that I think we all need it sometimes. I was curious, on Joe Rogan, you talked about an experience that made you, I think you quit all substances or quit psychedelics for 12 years, but Joe didn't really ask you about that. I was curious if you could tell us what that experience was about.
Yeah. Well, it was one of those typical bad trips. You're with people that you either don't know or don't like. There's kind of tension in the group. Yeah, and I took some LSD. It was my senior year in college. Yeah, and I was kind of in the middle of all this kind of interpersonal drama with friends and roommates and girlfriends and all that stuff. Yeah, and we were walking down, from day in the mountains, and it just kind of hit me all at once that I was insane, and I had always been insane, and I was just realizing it, even though the rest of the world had been interacting with me my whole life in the context of me being insane, and I was just discovering it, and I thought, oh, the jig's up. Yeah, and I was going to be ending up in a mental hospital for the rest of my life, and just all that stuff. um, so I kept quiet, and my friends dropped me off at uh, I'm at a I'm at sober friend's house. Thankfully, this was like an old childhood friend who was going to the same school at the time. Yeah, and I knocked on the door and I said I need help, and uh, we talked, and he said, well, so I explained this scenario, and he said, oh, that makes no sense. And I said, why do you think that? And he explained it, rather briefly. And yeah, it made no sense. And I came down, but still, I was so horrified that I never, tripped again for, 12 years. Yeah. In the meantime, I had, learned to meditate. I had spent time at a monastery,
Yeah.
finished medical school, all that stuff, so, and I started off with MDMA, which is a lot milder. Um, but still, I mean, those kinds of experiences need to be talked about,
Yeah.
because it isn't, that's not a challenging experience. There's this, meme out there, that adverse reactions are, they're not really, they're not really adverse reactions. They're, challenging experiences. I wouldn't call that uh, challenging experience. I would call it a temporary psychosis that left me scarred.
Hmm. Well,
Traumatic experience.
It was traumatic, yeah.
it,
Well, it was interesting. 12 years elapsed, and I had moved to New Mexico. I started working at UNM, and some friends of mine were kind of working in the MDMA underground. And they said, "Oh, you want to trip?" And I'll tell you, I was nervous because it was the first time I had taken any strong substance for quite a long time. Yeah, but MDMA, relatively speaking, is much more manageable than LSD.
It kind of what makes you want to ask the question, have you ever heard the line, when you get the message, hang up the phone? And I wanted to ask, have you heard it? And if you have, what does it mean to you? And what do you think that it means, the message per se?
Well, what is the message?
It's an Alan Watts quote, and I think it pertains to psychedelics, is usually the frame that it's put in, and he says, when you get the message, hang up the phone. Yeah, what is the message?
Like, how do you know if you got that message?
I think it's up to each individual, but I'd like to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think that comment was made to kind of keep people from abusing psychedelics, from taking them over and over and over again in order to recreate that feeling. But at the same time, you could trip on a regular basis and continue to articulate the message, to grow within the experience. Like for example, these ayahuasca using churches that have come up here from Brazil, they trip 2, 3, 4 times a month on ayahuasca. And it isn't an abusive relationship with ayahuasca. It's like a church. Mm-hmm. And their sacrament is ayahuasca as opposed to wine or peyote or what have you. So I think that comment was made in order to prevent people from abusing psychedelics. There are people who might have one big trip and it's a positive trip, and that's all they need. They understood. Well, when I was first, going to the Zen, monastery, under whose, supervision I trained for a couple of decades, most of the monks had gotten their first flash of enlightenment on LSD. So they took LSD, they perceived that there was another, way of looking at the world and interacting with it. And, they became monks, and, they never tripped again. There's all kinds of ways of using one's psychedelic experiences. But what is the message of the psychedelic state? Well, I think it depends on you. It depends on the person. What the drug works on, so to speak. It just could be pleasure, fun, creative, artistic, aesthetic. Or it could be philosophical, depending on your orientation. That's one of the reasons I think it's important to develop your intellect at the same time that you're experimenting with psychedelics. To be able to extract the most to be able to extract the most information that you can from your psychedelic experiences. From the visions and the voices, you could, kind of, what does it mean? How do I apply it? What sense does it make? How do I communicate it? Those kinds of things. Those are verbal, cognitive, kinds of processes, which I think can be quite useful in taking advantage of the altered state.
I think Ryan has some questions, but just before we get into that, I just wanted to say, the way that I first heard your name and was introduced to you was through your first book. I believe it was your first book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, where you had this groundbreaking psychedelic study that had not ever been, psychedelics had not been even studied since, what was it, the 50s, because they had become illegal.
The early 70s.
Okay, all right. And I just wanted to I've never heard from you a synopsis other than from the book, but a synopsis of what that book was and what it kind of meant to you. How would you explain it to somebody that has never read the book, or just kind of a quick overview, but in your words, and also how it came to be would be interesting, because I know I'm pretty sure when we last talked, you said, I don't know if it was the first time you did DMT. I think it was with the late great Terrence McKenna. And now, was it because of that experience that some other experiences that kind of led you to drop what you were doing and start studying DMT?
Well, my interest in studying, DMT, derived, from, my, longstanding interest in the chemistry uh, of altered states of consciousness, and specifically, spiritual experiences, and even, more specifically, the degree to which the, psychedelic state overlapped with the results of certain kinds of meditation. So I started off, looking at the pineal gland and melatonin because there wasn't much known about melatonin at the time. And, there was, some evidence it, could be psychedelic. So we studied melatonin at UNM. That was my first kind of independent, clinical research study. And we determined it was, solely sedating. It was not psychedelic. And in the meantime, I had learned about DMT. And then a year or two after that, I smoked, DMT with Terrence. Yeah, and I decided, well, the melatonin work is kind of a dead end, and DMT is obviously quite psychedelic. It's endogenous. It's made in the human body, and it was obscure. So I figured, and short acting. So if people got into tight spots in the hospital, where obviously this kind of work would have to start, it would be time limited. Yeah, so I ran the study, for 5 years, and wrapped it up in 1995. And once I started thinking about it and making sense of it, or at least trying to make sense of it, it seemed to me to be a great story. It was just a great story. FDA, DEA, Terrence, the university, the volunteers, um, just all that stuff, the staff, the chemistry, the psychopharmacology, the neuroendocrinology, the Buddhist part. Uh, yeah, it was a great story, which I felt, needed, uh, to be, written down. Yeah, so, that, was the impetus, was, to write the story of the DMT study. And, in a larger, sense, it was a personal story because self-disclose a lot about, what was going, through my mind at the time, before the study, during the study with specific volunteers and afterwards. Yeah. So, you know, I think one of the things that, people like about the book is its honesty. I mean, I just kind of spill the beans, like
Yeah.
I felt sick today from being with this volunteer XYZ. Uh, I just was, calling a spade, so to speak. Because I think there is this, glorified, Hollywood approach, to psychedelics now, and they're really gritty. Tripping people, having a trip, it's really gritty. It isn't like all, uh,
Yeah.
love and light, and especially in a hospital
Yeah.
with, funding from the war on drugs and all that stuff. So, it was pretty much out there, and I was not immune, to the things that were kind of swirling around me in the university at that time.
Yeah,
I just want,
I wonder if you could, well, you don't, I just wonder if you could real quick, well, never mind. We'll go to it later.
I was curious how the DMT death hypothesis came out. Was that something that you thought about? And like that when you die, you have this, DMT experience. And I'm also curious if do you believe in that?
Well, the relationship of the DMT state to the dying state um, was an example of non-drug states which resemble those brought about by psychedelic drugs. That was kind of the original impetus to start my research career. Was the question of whether there was a common biological denominator which was mediating the similarities between the psychedelic drug state and non-drug states, which share features with the psychedelic experience. So those include dreams, psychosis, near-death experiences, meditation, those kinds of things. So as I was looking into the biology of the pineal gland, back in the day, um, it seemed to me that the pineal gland could produce DMT, and it you might do it during the dying process. All the enzymes were there, all the precursors were there. It's quite hard to budge the pineal to to start synthesizing things when it isn't the proper time, like producing melatonin in the dark at night. So it seemed as if the pineal, responded to inordinate stress. We did a study, that was attempting, to stimulate the pineal gland to produce melatonin during the day, which had never been done before in humans. So we were drawing blood samples on these, marathon runners that, ran across the Sandias, this big mountain range, to the east of Albuquerque, pretty much in the snow. And we drew levels of melatonin, and lo and behold, the concentrations increased, but not by that much. So clearly you needed to really stress the pineal gland to activate its synthesis, at least of melatonin. So with the with the necessary enzymes and ingredients in the pineal gland to make DMT as well, I speculated that to the extent the near-death state resembles the DMT state, perhaps DMT is released at the time of death. So a few years ago, actually, in 2019, there was a study from Ann Arbor, John Dean and Jimo Borjigan, University of Michigan. They demonstrated that there were increases in brain levels of DMT in the dying rodent brain, especially in the visual cortex. So that is supportive of the notion that DMT, is released um, at the time of death, and specifically, it may be mediating the visual characteristics of the NDE.
Interesting. In your previous book, Joseph Levy Escapes Death, a big theme in that whole book, which is, loosely based on your life, is mortality. And it seemed like almost this character is testing that theory in his life. I wanted to ask you, what did those experiences, what did you learn from those experiences surrounding mortality? Did it make mortality more, like, you accept it more? Did it make you more grateful for life? What about that?
Well, the main, well, I suppose, there were a couple of take-home lessons, from, that year of, poor health, which I, wrote about in that book, Joseph Levy Escapes Death. Um, well, one of the, things, which I learned, or, the character learned, or I learned, and then, put into the character's,
Mm-hmm.
narration, uh, like I was, going into shock in this little hospital in the fictional town of Wheaton, Arizona. Yeah, and I was going into shock. I had pneumonia. They weren't really figuring out how to treat me. So my blood pressure was gradually dropping. My heart rate was gradually dropping, and nobody really cared. And I thought to myself, this is strange. I was expecting there to be fireworks and whatnot
Mm.
as I'm dying, but instead it was as if the volume were just being turned down.
Mm.
It was getting quieter and just kind of the volume was just, going down, kind of slowly but surely. Um, yeah, so I, bucked up. I just, dragged myself out of bed and started walking up and down the hallway. And I just said, I'm not going to die. This is ridiculous. This is a bad place to die. And, I don't need to die. Yeah, so it wasn't especially glamorous. Um, yeah. The other, I suppose, the longer or the longer term, take home lesson, was just being, glad to be alive. I was, thankful to God. I strengthened, my relationship with God. I, worked to understand, uh, God in a lot more, detail with a lot more effort, a lot more dedication. Um, in a way, it was kind of like anything after, that experience has been frosting on the cake.
Mhm.
Like I, could have died, and I had this incredible diarrhea within a week of coming home from that pneumonia, which almost killed me as well because nobody knew what to do here. So it was kind of like, well, if if I make it through these two illnesses, uh, everything else is just frosting on the cake. I mean, I've done my bit. I've kind of looked death in the face, and it's just not all that attractive, but that's how it is. And kind of like there's work to be done, but at the same time, like so it goes.
That story you told about that confrontation with death kind of empowering your life more and giving you more gratitude for life. I think that personally, I believe, in my own experience, that is what some psychedelic experiences can provide as well. That feeling of, I mean, literally, feeling like you're going to die in that experience. And then when you come out of it, there's a tremendous gratitude for life. And I was wondering what you thought about that. Like, if you thought that psychedelics could be used in that manner and if it would be valuable too.
Well, they could be, yeah, and even back in the 60s, they were doing studies, giving the terminally ill psychedelics, either LSD or DPT, with good success. People came to terms with their death, because of their, I guess, encounter with new ways of looking at their life and their personality and their family and existence and things that occurred under the influence. Keep in mind that those were kind of directed studies. People enrolled because they were dying. They got coached to understand the effects of the drugs in the context of dying. Um, so their experiences were steered in that direction and interpreted in that way. Um, you know, if you're just a random person and you want to trip, you may come to terms with your own death, or you may not. I think that's where the importance of the set and the setting come into play. Is you need to work out your intention. You need to have escape plans if things get if they start going south. Um, but yeah, if you lose your identity or your individual sense of self on a psychedelic, if you kind of have an out of body experience, or you dissociate from your body and you come to the realization that there at least could be consciousness without awareness of a body. Yeah, it can modify your views about mortality.
That's like one of a very big theme or topic that Ryan and I have been exploring for the past 2 years, not by taking so many psychedelics, but just by doing research and reading a lot of books and stuff. Because so you say those people were they're already headed towards their death, or they were potentially going to die. Well, I just want to speak about my experience briefly, just so I can. But it's about Well, no, I don't want to speak about it too much, but what I want to say is like, you take someone like me who, or you take someone, right? Take a drug addict who has multiple, very close encounters with death, through their drug use, and then someone comes to them with a psychedelic and says, "You're going to take this to, overcome your addiction," but and then so like the setting is obviously has to be perfect, and then the intention is to basically look at your addiction, look what it has made, what has made of you, what has come of it, and like how to like get over it. So like through my experience, it was like a very ethereal and like almost like experience of life and death. And I can just say there's a themes throughout my trip that was very symbolic of dying. Like it was almost like, when you take a high dose psychedelics and then there's like a loop and it's on repeat, and these like thoughts and images just can't go away. It was these thoughts of, and plus my niece was just born, in the a couple days earlier. So it was like, I was getting all these images I was getting these repeated images of life and death. And then like physically my hands, it felt as though I was wet and I was like just being born. And I was almost doing this with my hands for the first time. So,
I mean,
I'm not saying that like what
we think that psychedelics can be a powerful tool for creating that ritual experience of death and rebirth, and that initiation experience that, primitive cultures have used for, long time.
Yeah. And we've just been trying to figure out like, what's the best way to go about doing that for someone that ultimately has not come to terms with their mortality, because we believe that can motivate them to live life more fuller.
Well, the thing is about that experience is I think it's really no different than the unity spiritual experience that you've talked about. You talk about two separate spiritual experiences, the unity one that, everyone kind of talks about, of ego dissolution and, going into the light. But then you also talk about the prophetic ones, which very few people talk about, which I really appreciate you talking about. What?
Well, the prophetic one is, kind of shorthand for interactive states, where you interact and relate with the content of the experience. You maintain your own personality, your sense of self. There isn't a, dissolving of the ego into the white light and unity. It's more interactive and relational. The reason that, that the word, prophetic, plays a role is, because, the mystical experience is the unitive one, and mystical is a spiritual term, religious term, theological term. So the prophetic state is interactive and relational, and the paradigm anyway within a theological framework, at least from my studies, is the Hebrew Bible prophetic tradition. But I think it's best to remove the theology when you're talking psychology and psychiatry. So I think you could just call those two poles of spiritual experience, or any kind of like intense psychedelic state, either unitive or interactive.
Okay. So, have you had any personal experience with either of those, the spiritual or the prophetic? I mean, the unified.
Oh yeah.
And would you say that one?
Yeah.
Would you say that one is more valuable than the other, or would you say that they both provide, their benefits?
Yeah, they both provide potential benefits and potential pitfalls. The thing about the white light experience is that you really need to have a framework to understand it in. Like for example, one of my most memorable white light experiences. You gave me insight into verse of a Zen scripture I had been reciting for 20 years or so. The verse says something like, even the slightest twitch will surely break the rhythm. And I always kind of, knew what they were talking about, but in the white light, even the slightest twitch, the sense of thinking or looking around or, considering, kind of, pulled me out of the white light. So, that was like a experiential validation of that verse. Even the slightest twitch will surely break the rhythm. But I think for most people, or, for a lot of people, that what does that white light experience mean? I mean, what do you do with it? How do you remember it? How do you communicate it? How do you integrate it? It can be the benchmark of being completely blown away, but other than that, I think it's prone to kind of interpretation after the fact, which can be misused, I believe. With the interactive state, there's content. There's words, there's ideas, you can write them down, you can look at them later. They may not be as like, cosmic, but they, might be, just as useful or even more so because you can think about them, you can, chew on them, you can talk about them with your friends or your therapist or your spiritual teacher. So I think it, just depends, setting and, the development of other parts of your mind that can make sense of what just happened, to you.
That's really interesting. I wanted to ask you one question because I heard that you talked about this on one of your YouTube videos, that smoking weed or cannabis really helps your speech. And I was wondering, what's your hypothesis on that?
Oh, I don't know. Like I have really looked at my speech up, down, and sideways for most of my life. Yeah, it's just empirical. I mean, if I smoke, I'm more fluent.
Yeah.
The whole thing about a stammer isn't anxiety. That's what a number of people have been saying about that Joe Rogan interview is, oh, you seemed so relaxed, which I think was referring to the fact my stammer was not so bad. But it isn't relaxation or not. I think it's a neurological symptom which plays out in vocalization, and for whatever reason, some people they might stammer or stutter more when they're stoned. Other people might not. It in so in my case, it's usually I'm more fluent, but not always. I mean, sometimes it makes my speech worse.
So were you guys like smoking it up on the Joe Rogan podcast a lot, or was he offering you like weed and drink and?
Well, that's for me to know and you to find out.
Yeah,
that's funny. Let's see what else I got. I mean, the thing that about that unity experience that I don't mean to keep coming back to it, but I think
it's a big deal.
Yeah. I think that in some cases, it is, a practice for death, because the ego dissolution, letting go of yourself. And I mean, unity, a person cannot experience unity. That's kind of a paradox. The person has to dissolve into the unified state. And a lot of times you can't even understand it until you come out of it and you look back at it. So,
and then you're just left with your own self to make sense of it. But but like, we're all about, death and trying to figure out like how to develop a healthy relationship that empowers you. Right. Instead of, just ignoring it. And one problem I see in this culture is death is almost shied away. Like, people don't look, they don't want to talk about it. I mean, some people do, but like, generally speaking, it's not really a topic of discuss, like a large topic of discussion. So yeah. And if you ask people going into a psychedelic experience to talk about death or to think about it, they'd say, shut up. Yeah. They're gonna be like, you're giving me bad vibes or something, but it's like, ultimately it's to help. And so we think opening the discussion, or at least having groups of maybe like a groups of people that can start talking about it, because like, for example, if I take a psychedelic and I have a bad trip, whatever a bad trip means, maybe it was just because I was scared to death and I didn't know how to confront that. If I'm able to talk with someone else about it, then maybe I can make some sense about it.
Yeah, and the one caveat about that is that it has to be in the right setting, like you're saying. And I think that religious context is like the perfect setting. In the wrong setting, you have that experience, it'll traumatize you for life probably. But that religious setting that they have in those churches, it really empowers getting the most out of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. Well, back in the day when I was, close with the monks at the monastery and whatnot, we were talking about, can, psychedelics, prepare you, for death? Um, because it's a, common belief that, the, dying experience is like a, psychedelic, drug experience. Um, you know, and one of the monks, really caught me off guard when they said, well, what if it isn't anything, what if it isn't anything at all like a psychedelic experience? And you've kind of promoted this belief that it is.
Mhm.
So that kind of made me sit up straight, like, oh, yeah, that could be completely a false assumption.
Mhm.
Nevertheless, most people would agree with the approach you're taking, which is there are certain features of a big psychedelic experience which can't help but remind you of or make you think about death. So to the extent that there is that overlap and the stimulation of those thoughts and feelings, I think it can be beneficial.
Yes.
Another question I had is, um, I heard you talk about holotropic breath work, but I was wondering if this is one of them, if there are ways that you've experienced or researched of producing endogenous DMT experiences.
Yeah. So far, there isn't any way, at least in humans, to stimulate endogenous DMT. We're just understanding, the mechanisms of, DMT synthesis in the mammalian brain. That's just like we're just scratching the, surface of the iceberg, or the tip of the iceberg. Um, yeah, in what conditions is there more DMT produced, and what conditions is there less DMT produced? John Dean is at UC San Diego now. John was the first author on that 2019 paper. So his holy grail, like his goal is to visualize DMT in the living human brain.
Hmm.
With imaging, with functional magnetic resonance imaging and spectroscopy. Um, but we're not there yet, and you really can't measure blood levels of DMT with any sensitivity. The concentrations are just way too low. Uh, but still, to the extent that non-drug states resemble those brought on by giving DMT, it makes sense that endogenous uh, DMT is involved. Like the near-death state and dreams and certain characteristics of psychotic experience. They all share features with with what happens after you take DMT. So it would make sense that naturally occurring DMT plays a role.
Cool. That's actually all of my questions. But you got any?
I just wanted to kind of bring up one thing before we end is I don't know, I wanted to ask what it was like being around not to take the spotlight away, but around Terrence McKenna, or maybe smoking DMT with him, because there's this one video on YouTube that I think is absolutely hilarious. It's only about 5 minutes long. Yeah, it's hold on. There's okay, it's called Smoking DMT on the Peak of an LSD Trip by Terrence McKenna.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen it, but it's
I don't think so.
I mean, just the way he the way he uses his words and the way he describes things is just it's otherworldly. It's like it's just incredible to hear like the way he talks and the way he describes things. He was a true wordsmith.
A true wordsmith, yeah. Like a bard, the Irish bard. Well, it was great. I mean, Terrence and I weren't like super close friends. I mean, we met in '87, I think. Um, yeah, and we hung out a bit. I spent some time at his place. Yeah, I smoked DMT. So he supervised my first DMT experience. Sat for it. Yeah, and then we kind of strategized the next year about the DMT study. I was driving down from Canada and had switched the melatonin work, but wasn't quite sure how to do the DMT study. So we brainstormed for most of the day, and came out with the skeleton of the DMT project. The gross kind of structure on an outline. Yeah, Terrence was a gentleman and a scholar, like a super nice guy, very friendly, very easy to get along with. Yeah, we spent some time on his plantation in Hawaii too, '93, I think '94.
That's super interesting. Super interesting place to me. I don't know much about it, but I've seen some video.
Yeah, so it was 20 acres on the Big Island on the west, the western side of the Big Island. And I think when he and Kat got divorced, they split it down the middle. And then I think after Terrence died, Leanna Standish, who's a naturopath and interested in ayahuasca, bought Terrence's 10 acres. She's at Bastyr University. So I'm not sure what's going on with that property now. I think that Kat still owns that original one half, although I'm not sure.
He had a girlfriend when he died. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you know what happened? What happened to her?
I never met her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating. It's all fascinating.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here, and I encourage everyone to go out and check out the Psychedelic Handbook, and also Joseph Levi or Levi Escapes Death.
Yeah, and the first book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, which I just loved reading the trip reports that people gave you, because you had a notebook, right, while you were doing the studies, that you would take like you would take like measurements of the blood pressure and everything, like you were doing medical stuff, but at the same time you were taking their anecdotal reports.
Yeah. I took very careful notes. Well, one of the things that I learned as a medical student is how to take notes without any resistance. Because if you resist, like if the lecturer is a strange person, you're kind of fixated on the strange person, rather than the data or the material that he's sharing or she's sharing. So I kind of learned to be a note taking conduit, like in the ear, out the pen. Yeah. So that's what I was doing during those DMT sessions, and I would also comment about the weather and the garbage compactor outside, and my nurse sniffling or me coughing,
which gave it a very like I'm in the room type of vibe when I read it.
Well, good. Yeah. Well, like I was saying, it's a great story, and I think it deserved being told.
I mean, I regard you up as some of the top psychedelic people of all time, like Albert Hoffman, and I guess Terrence would be up there. Timothy Leary, and he probably deserves to be up there too.
Yeah, I think he does. Yeah, Stan Groff's up there.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I guess John Lilly in some ways.
Yeah, I don't know John Lilly, actually.
I heard you.
So he was a ketamine guy. He kind of
Oh,
introduced the psychedelic community to ketamine.
oh, see, yeah, I don't have any experience with ketamine,
The
so
first
I
time I
was.
heard that name was actually when I was listening to you on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I looked him up, and he has a pretty interesting story.
Very interesting story. Yeah. Well, he started off with dolphin human communication. That was
Oh,
Really?
I
his.
have heard of this. Yeah.
No way.
Yeah. That was his claim to fame, and then he just kind of took more and more ketamine and got more and more interested in ketamine.
More and more dissociated. Now I'm just, there's just a joke on the drug itself because it's a
Right.
dissociative.
Yeah, it's a strange drug. Well, it's incredibly popular now as an antidepressant. I mean, there's ketamine clinics springing up everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the stories I'm beginning to hear about these ketamine clinics is that people need their ketamine injection every 2 weeks,
Mm.
and they
Wow.
come in every 2 weeks because they need their ketamine injection. It may turn out to be a bit of a Frankenstein.
Wow.
I think ketamine was a good it was a good kind of starting point to consider psychedelic clinics.
Mhm.
But I think as a kind of a mainstay of the discipline, I think it'll fade within a few years.
Have you ever considered like relicensing as a psychiatrist and doing psychedelic psychiatry work?
Well, I mean, I'm still, I still have my MD. I just renewed it a couple of months ago.
Hmm.
So I've got my license, and I've got my DEA permits, 2 through 5.
Oh, wow.
Schedule 1 compounds are the psychedelics, but that may change at some point.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think about it, but not that. Seriously. Like I was giving a lot of DMT for 5 years, like 6 days a week, 7 days a week,
Yeah.
and I think I'm good.
But, I was curious. What is your first opinion of when people said they were abducted by aliens or encountered these entities, and how has that opinion changed over the years?
Well, it seemed kind of strange, and I was skeptical. And
Mhm.
then after a while, my skepticism wasn't really helping the flow of conversation.
Yeah.
And so I figured, well, what the heck? I mean, might be true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, yeah. So I started off skeptical, and then I suspended disbelief.
Mm.
Yeah, well, Whitley Strieber wrote that book called Communion. It's one of the first and best books about abductions. And we were talking about this like just after my DMT book came out in 2000, I think, 2001. Yeah, and we were talking about the stigmata which occur in a lot of abductions, like the burns and the uh, puncture wounds and implants of metal and things like that. And clearly there wasn't anything like that going on in my study. But as a result of that conversation, I kind of came up with the notion of, like a spectrum of encounters. Some can be physical, and I have no opinion about those. But the others, could be, purely consciousness to consciousness, without any, physical signs. So, once again, to the extent, that those kinds of alien encounters resemble what happens on a DMT experience, you could speculate that naturally occurring DMT is playing a role.
And now, have you heard? I think just to kind of wrap it up because I got to get going. But I wanted to ask you: have you heard? I forget the guy's name, but basically he wrote a book, Aliens and Insects, or something like that. But it's basically about this long, extended DMT infusions.
Oh yeah, that's Andrew Gallimore.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So the book is called Alien Information Theory.
Okay.
Yeah, and
I was way off.
oh, well, you had the alien part, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Well, so that came out a couple of years ago. Well, toward the end of my DMT book, I suggest that if you want to spend more time in the DMT state, for whatever reason, you ought to consider a continuous infusion, like over the space of an hour or, two, or, however long. Yeah, and a few years back, I think 2016, Andrew contacted me and he said, "Oh, let's write a paper about that. I can, kind of, do the, pharmacology part, and you can do the clinical implications." Yeah, so we published that in 2016.
Oh wow, so that was
Yeah,
your
and
idea.
yeah,
Oh, cool.
yeah, and so there's a group at Imperial College, that has actually, taken the ball and is running with it. They ran, I think, 12, 18 people. I'm not sure. It was over 10 at least. And yeah, they gave an infusion over the space of a half hour at, 4 different levels. So you can do it. And I think, they're going to be seeing if it's possible, to extend it even, longer than a half hour. There's a couple of good things about, doing that. One would be you could characterize the state more carefully because you wouldn't just be blasted into it and then, blasted out of it. You can more leisurely look around. Yeah, and I think, therapeutically, it could be useful too because, depending on what you're talking about or thinking about or working on with your therapist, you could, take it higher, take it lower. You can, stop the infusion entirely, process, things in a sober state. So I think it's both got, kind of informational value to, explore that continuous infusion and, could be therapeutic. I'm consulting with a group now at UCLA, that's interested in using DMT in veterans who have PTSD. And we're thinking about the model that I developed when we were seeing if you could develop tolerance to repeated dosing of DMT. We gave people a big dose every half hour, 4 times in the morning. So I think you could do that and also be able to work, therapeutically on stuff without, necessarily, having, to work out all of the, complicated, mathematics in a way of a, continuous infusion. Um, you could enter that state, you come down, you talk to your therapist, enter that state again, work on what you were just talking about, come down, talk about it. So that's easier. That's going to be easier, than the continuous infusion, and it may be just as useful.
Mm-hmm. I just want to ask you one more question before you go. What is your favorite book or most influential book that you've read in your life?
The Hebrew Bible. I mean, I study it every day. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah. The Torah, the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. That's called the Torah. It's the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. There's a schedule that you can go. That you can go through it every year. Once a year. And I've been doing that since 1996. So I've
Wow.
read the Torah 26 times. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I just love it. It's kind of a weird thing, but go figure.
Cool.
It's fitting. Very fitting for who you are and the conversations we've had. So
yeah. Well, we'll let you go. We appreciate talking to you so much, and really grateful, and we hope everyone who's listening and watching enjoyed it as much as we did.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to be on your podcast again. Yeah, if you could send me the link, once it's up and running, I could share it on my so-called social media.
awesome.